the House would be the Senate, where the bill is expected to face a tougher road. Join us now on this and more, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, the ranking member on the Commerce Committee. Would you be a yes on the bill as it currently stands, Senator?
Well, it depends. It depends what the bill specifically says. I will say this. I'm glad the House is acting. I am deeply concerned about TikTok. I've been very vocal about my concerns in TikTok. We had the CEO of TikTok testify before the Judiciary Committee just a few weeks ago, and I vigorously question him really on two fronts. I'm concerned about TikTok. Number one, I'm concerned about Chinese surveillance and espionage. TikTok is controlled by the Chinese Communist government. It has 170 million users in the United States, and it gives the Chinese government the ability to monitor, number one, what they're saying, number two, their physical location using GPS, number three, potentially what they're searching for and what they're doing with their phone. All of that is concerning, and we also know that China has used it to target journalists in particular, going after them on TikTok. That's one set of concerns. A second set of concerns is the propaganda that the Chinese government pushes on TikTok, and pushes in particular at kids. And I think it is deeply, deeply harmful. You know, you look right now at the Israel-Hamas war that is unfolding. Every age cohort of Americans, when asked who's in the right, who do you side with, overwhelmingly Americans side with Israel, except for one age cohort. And that is 18 to 29. And we see TikTok in particular pushing pro-Hamas propaganda. I think it is deliberate. I think that is designed by the Chinese government. And so I'm glad the House is acting to address what I think are very serious risks.
Right. The privacy issue seems like it's something that it either exists or it doesn't exist, Senator. As far as the propaganda issue, we had former President Trump had kind of an interesting flip-flop on this. I know you've probably seen it, and there's some swirling around about who he's talked to that it might be, maybe even have some campaign financing or something, the gentleman from Susquehanna. But he does make one interesting point. Do you think, I mean, there's Chinese propaganda, and there's propaganda that I'm sure you've noticed on some of the American social media platforms. I mean, pick your poison. They're both bad. But his point was that you get rid of TikTok, you're just giving Meta and all the maybe the perpetrators here of what you would call propaganda. They just become even more powerful. Is there anything to that?
Well, the problem is that disregards the actual facts of what's going on online. Listen, I'm a big critic of big tech in general. I have been the leading critic of Facebook and Google and YouTube and their censorship of speech. It is an enormous problem. I'm the ranking member right now on the Senate Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over 40% of the U.S. economy, including the Internet. And if Republicans win a majority in November, I'll be the chairman of the Commerce Committee, and I think protecting free speech online is critically important. But, Joe, there's a difference. As much as I don't like what Google or YouTube or Facebook does, they are American companies. They are not owned and controlled by the Chinese government. And it's not simply the algorithm. Let me give you some data from a recent study comparing different hashtags on TikTok versus comparing them on Instagram. The hashtag Tibet was 30 times more common on Instagram than on TikTok. The hashtag Uyghur was 8 to 1 on Instagram versus TikTok. The hashtag Tiananmen Square was 57 to 1 on Instagram versus TikTok, and this one's the one that's most compelling. The hashtag Hong Kong protests was 174 to 1 more likely to appear on Instagram than TikTok. That's not accidental. That is deliberate. That is clearly, I believe, driven by the Chinese government because they want to suppress speech they don't like. Right. And so I think the House is acting to address a real national security issue. And importantly, Joe, what the House has done, as I understand it, is not ban TikTok. And so a lot of the headlines, House votes to ban TikTok, are inaccurate. What the House has done is said China needs to sell TikTok, that the Chinese Communist government cannot own and control TikTok, and if China doesn't sell it, then they will ban TikTok. But understand the objective of this legislation is not to eliminate TikTok, but to put it on the same footing as Facebook and Google and YouTube and get the Chinese government out of that business.
Senator, do you use TikTok yourself?
I do not.
Have you ever used it?
I've seen it. I have not done a TikTok, but,
Right.
you know, I'm also not a 13-year-old girl, so I don't do a lot of synchronized dance routines.
I understand. The reason I ask, and not to defend the platform, I've tried it because I was curious to search for the word Tibet, to search for Uyghurs, to search for Hong Kong protests, because I've seen the same studies that you've seen. And for whatever reason, it's very available on TikTok, meaning you have to type the words in. I mean, that's the only way I found it. It wasn't served directly to me. But to the extent that we believe that the Chinese government is somehow running TikTok, you would think it would be harder to find the stuff. You put the words in, and you can go on a tear. I mean, you can go down a rabbit hole on these issues with some of the most provocative content you could imagine, things that I imagine you might agree with in terms of being very critical of the Chinese government, in fact. And so the reason I mention this is I just wonder whether you have seen some kind of classified or other internal documentation that shows the Chinese government actively doing something beyond the sort of studies that we've seen that say that we're seeing more of this or less of this or whatever, but actual evidence that there's email traffic or telephone calls between Chinese government officials and people inside TikTok saying, hey, tweak the algorithm to do this.
So what I would say is that you're asking the wrong question there. It's not if you go affirmatively looking for content that is about Hong Kong or Tibet, can you find it? It is rather, what is TikTok suggesting to the user? Because one of the most powerful tools any social media company has is their suggestion algorithm of watch this next, and it's how they drive a message. And I'll tell you, our knowledge of this has grown exponentially ever since Elon Musk purchased Twitter. When he went open kimono and he showed how Twitter was consciously, directly driving messaging consistent with their political ideology. And on X, he changed that. I think that is the single most important step for free speech we've had in modern times. You know, I'll give another example of the differential in content. And this is something that I asked the TikTok CEO in front of the Judiciary Committee. I said, how come in China, when Chinese kids are using the equivalent of TikTok, your Chinese product, they're getting videos on math and science and education and discipline. And here, when our kids are using TikTok, they're getting pushed, they're getting suggested, you know, chewing on Tide Pods. I mean, it's dramatically different, and I think the Chinese government has an agenda there. They're not subtle about it.
The product in China is a completely different product, directed in a completely different way. But by the way, is set up because there are relatively authoritarian and draconian rules in China because it's an authoritarian and draconian government rule. The U.S. is a different place. And you have to decide what you want to be. You talk about free speech. Free speech in China doesn't exist.
Well, you're right, which is why none of us should want the Chinese Communist government in charge of free speech and public discussion in the United States. The particular bill, as I said, I have not examined it. If and when the House passes it, it'll come over to the Senate. I'll address it on the merits. And to be clear, there's been legislation introduced on this topic that I think is dangerous, that goes too far. I don't want to empower the U.S. government to begin censoring and using power against social media companies more broadly. So if and when that bill comes over, I'm going to look at it closely. But the concern about TikTok is real and significant. And my objective, if we actually pass legislation, is not to eliminate TikTok, but it is to eliminate the Chinese Communist government's control and power over TikTok. And I think that's a qualitatively different concern than any other social media company.
Senator, we not much time, and I know you wanted to talk briefly about the the NIL stuff, the name, image, and likeness, but I got to ask you about the budget and the one introduced by President Biden, because I don't see how, if it was a Republican-led budget, I still don't see how we get below 100% debt to equity at any time in the next 10 years. And I wonder if you worry about that and have a solution. How would we do it? How would Republicans do it? I mean, the one Biden introduced isn't going to be law, and it's horrific, but you've got no answers. Republicans don't.
Well, that's not true. Let's take them one at a time. Let's focus first on the Biden budget. This Biden budget is not a real budget. It is a political campaign. It proposes massive new spending. It proposes $17 trillion in new debt, so our debt gets worse and worse and worse. It proposes $5 trillion in brand new taxes because, you know, as our economy is struggling and people are hurting, what the Biden administration is saying is let's tax the hell out of job creators, let's hammer job growth, and in particular, it goes after the oil and gas industry. Because, you know, when you fill up your car, you think, I really think gasoline needs to be more expensive. I really think we need to be spending $10 a gallon to fill up my car or truck. Well, then you may be a congressional Democrat or work in the Biden White House. This is a budget that is out of step. By the way, it's also a budget that does zero to secure the border. It asks instead for more money to fly more illegal immigrants to more cities in America to expand the invasion at our southern border. It is a political document, not a real budget. Now, you said Republicans have no agenda. I disagree strongly. I think the only answer on the economy, the only answer on deficits and debt is we've got to get GDP growth up back to historic levels. And the way to do that is tax reform and regulatory reform. Instead of massive new taxes on job creators, we ought to be cutting taxes, simplifying the tax code, and repealing the 94 executive actions that Biden has taken to hammer American energy, to hammer American oil and gas, to unleash America's energy dominance. That drives prices down for everyone. That's how we turn things around as we get back to growth.
All right, Senator, we're out of time. We'll